Why? Everyone else is doing it. When used as a reasoning for behaving a certain way, this phrase usually isn't good enough, at least not in our society. Why? Well, in our society, we tend to value individual differences. Individualist societies value the risk takers, the innovators, the people who step out from the crowd and try something new. We appreciate the idea that one person can outthink the rest. And we celebrate this, right? This has become the dominant logic for everything from how we market products to one another to how we solve problems in our communities. And usually there's a core assumption to this logic, the idea that it's the responsibility of the individual to change his or her mindset or attitude, behavior. Think about the campaigns and interventions which address harmful behaviors and practices, things like domestic violence or racism. You might see a poster at the bus stop or whiz by a billboard on the freeway or see an ad on TV, but we scarcely pay attention, right? Usually these kinds of campaigns and interventions have a few common elements. One thing they do is place the responsibility entirely on the individual to change. So on the surface, a poster in the men's bathroom about domestic violence might seem like a mass media campaign, but it's actually premised on the expectation that I, as an individual, will somehow take in that information and change my behavior because of it. And we assume that an individual can do this autonomously. Second, because the emphasis is placed on the individual, it becomes about their transgression, their wrongdoing. And the rhetoric is usually quite negative. It's usually to stop, halt, reduce. We do little to understand what intrinsically motivated that behavior to come about in the first place, and therefore how to prevent it from happening again in the future. And so therefore, we're giving people no clear way out. We're telling them to stop their behavior, get treatment, seek counseling, reform your behavior, and yet we're giving them no clear pathway forward. So if I am to stop doing what I'm doing, well, what should I be doing? The reality is these kinds of campaigns and interventions are largely unsuccessful at achieving behavior change at scale because they're often addressing behaviors that are driven by things like addiction or habit. How many of us have made New Year's resolutions and not kept to them, right? So sometimes we know intellectually what we need to do, but we don't do it because there are so many other influencing factors at play. Now, one of the largest reasons why these campaigns and interventions are unsuccessful at achieving behavior change is because they're often also competing with deep-seated social norms and expectations. Scientifically speaking, social expectations, or this idea that I behave a certain way because I think others expect that of me, it's one of the most powerful motivators human beings can have. We want to align our behavior with the group because aligning with the group brings social acceptance. And social acceptance, frankly, trumps almost everything. So in some sense, this idea of, well, everyone else is doing it, it actually has great power over us. It drives our behavior to some extent. Now, in an individualist society, that's probably a little cringeworthy to hear, but in a collectivist society, it's the opposite. Let me show you what I mean. The ancient societies of sub-Saharan Africa, these are collectivist communal societies where the needs of the community are put above the needs of the individual, and where doing what everyone else is doing actually brings a sense of harmony and connectedness. There's that incredible South African philosophy of Ubuntu, which states that I am because we are, and we are because I am. Collectivist societies have a high degree of cohesion around things like norms of behavior, but also things like humor and communication style, and usually the harmony of the group is preserved even if there are individual differences. So this means that these kinds of communities also have a completely different toolbox when it comes to how they're addressing harmful behaviors and practices. The desire to conform is powerful because it's meaningful, which also means that if someone does deviate from the norms of the group, it's a risk. They can be seen as violating the invisible rules of the group, and that can be met with disapproval or fear. But what about when deviating from the norms of the group is positive and constructive? What about when not doing what everyone else is doing actually leads to an outcome that's better for the community or the group as a whole? For the last several years, I've been working on projects in Ethiopia and the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. These projects were focused primarily on stimulating some kind of positive behavior change. Now, the Ethiopian government has set an ambitious goal of eliminating childhood stunting for all children under the age of 2 by the time of 2030. Stunting is this phenomenon that's caused by malnutrition or undernutrition, which means that children basically just aren't eating the right kinds of foods in order to develop mentally and physically. In Ethiopia, what land is used for farming is mostly used to grow crops that are sold off to market, and then what teeny tiny bits of land are left over might then be used to grow food for the household. Still, there are a number of highly nutritious, widely available foods that are just not eaten due to certain cultural or social norms. I remember visiting a mountain village called Debark, and I was going into a woman's home. She was telling me what she fed her baby, and it was clear the baby was suffering. The next day, we gathered a pretty diverse group of people from the community. We had Orthodox priests, school principals, nurses, mothers, fathers, etc. We were hoping to gather some insight into what were the barriers to eating certain kinds of foods. One man said, "I grow pumpkin, but only to feed to my livestock. I've never fed it to my children." He didn't realize that humans could safely consume it. We did come across a few people in the village who mentioned they consume pumpkin and were willing to share some ideas around it. So weeks later in the village center, we held an event to celebrate the different uses of pumpkin. And the community held events after that to celebrate the different seasonal varieties of foods. Costumes were brought out, drums were played, skits were performed, and it was all to demonstrate different recipes with these foods and to celebrate that. And another case was in Somalia. Now, Somalia has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, meaning women are needlessly dying from complications from childbirth. There are many reasons why this is happening, of course, but one of the reasons is that these are traditionally nomadic communities whose movements would normally be dictated by their camels' need for water or new grazing areas. So in some sense, having your baby and delivering your baby in the comfort of your own home has always just been practical, and that tradition has continued on until today. But now we're asking these women to completely shift that behavior and to deliver their babies on site at a local health facility or health clinic with a skilled professional. These clinics are places that these women admittedly perceive as being quite intimidating, sterile, not very private, etc. We did meet a few women in the local village who mentioned delivering their baby on site at the local clinic. They had no idea this was an exception to the rule. They mentioned doing so because it was conveniently located or because it was free. And it was powerful for us to hear these stories, and we thought, well, why don't we leverage this in a creative way? So one thing we did was we started holding birth preparedness classes on site at the local health facility. This did a few things. So one thing it did is it familiarized women with the facility and the nurses who worked there, which made the idea of delivering their babies there much less foreign. Second, it celebrated the stage of life these women were in, and it gave them a dedicated time and space in which to support one another, share knowledge. And lastly, maybe most importantly, for the women who had delivered at the facility before, it gave them a platform in which to talk about that and encourage others to do the same. Now, as you can imagine, Lamaze classes were definitely not a thing in Somalia at the time. So the class was hugely popular. We had women who were 6 and 7 months pregnant traveling on foot for miles just to come and attend the class. And the culmination of the class was a safe delivery on site at the local health facility. These two stories demonstrate what some call positive deviance, and it's a powerful force in collectivist societies in particular. I think when we hear the term deviance, we think of someone who's conniving or defiant or somehow intentional about breaking the rules, but in this case, positive deviance refers to someone who moves away from the norms of the group without the intention to break the rules. They do so because of some kind of intrinsic motivation to do something different. Positive deviance is actually a social and behavior change approach, which observes that within a community or a social group, some people will employ uncommon yet successful strategies or behaviors, and that will enable them to find better solutions. So the idea here is we all have access to the same resources, but because of different circumstances or attitudes, we make different choices. And some of those choices lead to very positive outcomes. And the beauty of this is that in a collectivist society, the positive deviant almost never acts alone. They usually come in groups, which makes their deviation from the norm a lot less risky. So they're not in it to become the hero. They're usually more driven by this notion of, gosh, I really don't want to let my community down, than they are driven by this notion of, gosh, I really just have to be the best at this one thing. So again, this is what I mean when I say these communities have a completely different toolbox when it comes to how they're addressing social problems and certainly how they're addressing harmful behaviors and practices. So, what does all this mean for us sitting here in Australia? Well, I think on the surface, we think of Australia, like my home in the United States, as being a highly individualist society, mostly driven by liberal values and the effects of capitalism. But if we dig a little bit deeper, I think we'll see many signs of collectivism here in Australia, just like in Africa. Australia federated relatively early in its history, meaning it never had any need for narratives of rugged individualism or pioneering into new territories like in the US due to the gold rush. Australia was also one of the first English-speaking countries to have a social welfare system. Now, this is one of those cornerstones of the Australian experience, and it speaks to a set of values about making personal sacrifices for the sake of the common good. And lastly, I think one of the most compelling examples of collectivism here in Australia is this concept of the tall poppy syndrome. It's very important to Aussies to consider how one's achievements affect those around them. This concept is much less common in places like the UK and frankly doesn't really exist probably in any form in the United States, but here it's embraced as a core Australian ideal. Recently, people like Brittany Higgins and Grace Tame have prompted new and important dialogues about where social change happens and how social change happens in our communities, in our society, in our homes. When it comes to addressing harmful behaviors and practices, why don't we stop instating measures of control from the outside and start replicating the successes which have already been achieved on the inside? Now, the good news is there's nothing new to invent here. There's no reason to invest any time or money into creating something entirely new because positive deviance encourages us to make use of the strengths we already have. Communities all over the world are already self-organizing to solve their own problems, and they hold this kind of collective intelligence. So it's just about finding that and bringing it to the fore. And because of that, positive deviance is a powerful paradigm for addressing today's problems today. There's no need to delay because the method is so simple. Rather than focusing on the individual and their transgression, their wrongdoing, our job is just to find the rule breakers. Find the people who have already cracked it in the right ways and give visibility to that. Motivate people by showing them what positive change can look like. Let me give you a few practical examples. Consider your workplace. Who are the whistleblowers? Who are the people who speak up and speak out when they see incidences of bullying and harassment? How might we leverage what they're already doing in order to prevent those behaviors from happening again in the workplace? And what about in our healthcare settings? The healthcare professionals who invest time in building a rapport with their patients, building trust, making sure they feel safe throughout their health journey, these professionals tend to be in much higher demand. How might we scale what they're already doing across the healthcare system? And if we could do that, could we do the same with something like binge drinking, racism, sexual assault? What if we celebrated the good as a strategy to protect our communities against the bad? Now, doing this requires us to admit to ourselves that our individualist logic is faulty, and that we might benefit from adopting a more collectivist one. And so now this notion of, well, everyone else is doing it, it starts to take on a whole different meaning, doesn't it? It starts to feel a lot more like a strategy than an excuse. Positive deviance is a powerful way for us to more effectively achieve social change at scale, but it does require us to completely shift our thinking and to start celebrating who we are together, not as individuals. We, not I. Thank you.